send their plan back to the counties, and then the counties have to adopt a final plan on redistricting, and that becomes the county's supervisory district plan, the municipal ward plan, all of that for the next 10 years until we have another federal census. The issue that we have is that in the statutes, 59.10 sub 3, it indicates that no later than July 1, counties have to adopt a tentative plan. Some might think, you know what, that makes sense because July 1 gives us ample time to get done with the redistricting process before we hit December 1, when papers are taken out for the upcoming spring election in 2022. Makes sense. Problem is that we've been told that we will not get results from the federal census until, and I don't know if they've released an actual date, Marcy or Kyle, but it's late July is the earliest that I've heard.
Yeah, I think the guidance, Andy, from the Census Bureau has been that data will not be available until sometime later than July 30th is, I believe, the date. So sometime after that, we don't know if that means August, September, October, or November, but that's, I think, where the guidance sits right now, Andy.
And so when we look at the statutes and getting back to this issue of, okay, if we don't have a tentative plan by July 1st, what do we do? Well, the statutes really peg that July 1 date as the latest that a county can adopt a tentative plan. In normal years, if we have our census data by April, a county could act at a board meeting in April and adopt a tentative plan, transmit to the munis, and then the municipalities have 60 days to adjust their wards, send their plan back to the county, and the county then has 60 days to adopt a final plan. So in theory, you could have a final plan in August or September in a normal year. And so really we're talking about a 60-60 type turnaround situation here after a county adopts a tentative plan. So if we get the census data in, let's just be optimistic here, say we get it the first week of August, counties are going to need time to take that census data, perform their calculations, draw their boundaries, and send their tentative plan to the municipalities. Let's say that the counties do all that work and send their tentative plan to the municipalities in 45 days by September 15. Well, then on September 15, the municipalities then have a period of 60 days under statute to adjust their wards and send their plan back to the counties. So that puts us out around November 15th. After the municipalities send their plan back to the counties have 60 days in which to adopt a final plan. And so the numbers just don't add up. You're seeing here that the 60-60, if we start with that turnaround and we start this late in the process, there's no way that we can meet our obligation to provide a final plan in time for the upcoming spring 2022 election. And so to Kyle's point earlier, the question is, what do we do about this? And so let's talk first about, well, let's go through a couple of what ifs here. What if we do nothing? What if we have the statutes as they currently sit and we are just unable as counties to adopt a final plan for the before the spring 2022 election, meaning that when individuals take out papers to run for office in December of this year, what happens if we don't have a plan adopted? Well, we just go under the current boundaries. The law does not provide that there's any sort of temporary or stopgap measure. And so we go with the current boundaries as it relates to supervisory districts and municipal wards. And that's just the way it is. And then this whole issue of adopting a final plan, tentative plans, and all of that essentially gets punted. We don't really have guidance on exactly how it's punted or whatnot, because all of the statutes talk about the year following a decennial census. Well, if we don't have a plan adopted and we start this redistricting process, will actually be 2 years after the decennial census. And so there's a disconnect between the statutory language and what is actually going to occur. But, you know, the what if worst case scenario is that we just go with current boundaries for the 2022 spring elections. Some of you may be wondering too, well, what about the legislative redistricting plan? Isn't that impacted by what counties and municipalities do? It is and it isn't. It is in that I think the legislature has an interest in understanding where municipal ward lines and county district lines are drawn, but there is nothing indicating that the legislature has to wait for that information, nothing indicating that the legislature cannot move ahead with its redistricting process concurrent with, prior to, or following the county process. So they're two separate type of redistricting processes, and the legislature will go at its own pace. And that's a constitutional issue for the legislature, not a statutory issue like we're facing here. And so to Kyle's point earlier, from our perspective as legal counsel for the association, we want to make sure that whatever solution ends up being the right solution that counties can implement, and it creates some practical certainty and provides counties with what they need in order to go through a meaningful redistricting process. Before I turn it back to Kyle and Marcy and maybe open it up for questions, Ben, is there anything that I missed here in terms of important items that we need to think about?
No, I think you covered I mean, it's a pretty simple issue. Like you said, this is the date in statute and we're not gonna be able to meet that. We might not get the census data until October for all we know.
And so when I think about the potential solutions here, two very broad solutions come to mind. Number one, we could just build in a delay and say, you know what, we're not going to do it in 2021. Let's just redistrict in 2022. We're going to hold our spring 2022 elections consistent with the plan that is currently in place. We could essentially punt for a year to give us time to redistrict. The other solution, and this is a little bit, it creates some nervousness here or anxiety, is that we could compress the time frame. In other words, we could say within 30 days of receiving the census data, counties have to redistrict and provide a tentative plan to the munis. And then the munis have a period of 30 days thereafter to transmit back to the counties their ward plans. And then the counties have a period of 30 days to complete the final plan. If we think about that in terms of the calendar, if December 1st is the deadline, and that is the deadline, and that's not changing for taking out papers. So we back off at December 1st, 30 days, November 1st, 30 days, October 1st, 30 days, September 1st. And so counties would have to really hope and pray that we get census data in August in order to complete that tentative plan in a timely fashion.
Andy, with that, I see we had a question from Mark Gables Allison exactly to that, asking if we can expedite the process by taking less than 60 days. And to your point, I think the answer is yes, but we don't know how far we have to shrink those windows, right? Because we don't know exactly when the date is coming. We just know it's sometime after the end of July. So Andy, we also have a question here from Jill in Wapaka. Once we get the data, is it a we are done, we can move forward? Or is it one for all and one and all for one type situation for counties? So let's say that Wapaka gets their redistricting done by December 1st, but Bayfield does not. How does that work, Andy?
That's a great question, because right now it's a statutory mandate that counties have to get this done within a certain time frame. And so I think it is an all for one, one for all thing, that it's a 72 county issue as it relates to the deadlines that we've currently got in statute. I see a question in the chat about, is there a potential for a legislative fix? And I think absolutely. And I know that the association has been in contact with the Speaker's office. This goes back, 6 months ago, when everybody was anticipating a delay in the census data. And so the legislature is very well aware of this issue and is willing to work with the association on trying to fix this. But again, I think we want to create a fix that works. We don't want a fix for a fix's sake. So that's what we're looking at.
Andy, we have another question in the Q&A. Is there any work that can be done without census data? This would get the municipalities and the counties ahead of the game, and then just plug in the new numbers once the census data is released.
Yeah, I would imagine there probably is work that can be done prior to receipt of the census data. I don't know exactly what that is, because I've never been involved personally in the process of redistricting. And so, I mean, I'm aware of the legal principles that apply to redistricting, but in terms of the GIS data and other things other considerations that go into this process, I'm sure there probably is work that can be done in advance. How much, I don't know. And I don't know exactly how, from a very ground level perspective, how the census data gets plugged into the GIS, gets plugged into the current supervisory district boundaries to determine whether lines need to be redrawn in order to meet the one person, one vote principles that we have as a constitutional prerogative. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, yeah, I'm sure there's things that can be done, but I don't know exactly what they are.
Andy, we also have we have a number of questions here. But one, Wendy from Racine County said, just a reminder that even if you create those plans in a compressed time frame, if she recalls correctly from past redistricting, each stage also requires a public hearing on the plan with appropriate notice, which I know is something that's covered in our redistricting handbook as well. So it'd be good for every county to take a look at that. Another question.
Just pause it. Let me pause there for a second, Kyle. Ben, is it a class 2 notice on the public hearing? 2-week notice, 2 insertions? Which is it? I can't recall off the top of my head. Do you know?
I'm not sure off the top of my head either.
It's a public hearing requirement, and I think
Yeah.
it's a class 3 notice. Okay. So yeah, there's time that has to be built into the public hearing requirement as well. That's a very good point. So whatever we do to compress, just understand that we have to have sufficient time in which to provide notice to the public of the public hearing and then hold a public hearing on the tentative plan and the final plan.
Another question here from Kayla. Between the two options, the legislative options Andy just mentioned, who decides what process we go with? As far as, do we shrink the time frame or move redistricting to 2022? I think the answer to that is it really depends what legislative fix we as an association with this kind of input from membership decides is the right route to go. And I see there was a suggestion on kind of a hybrid fix, which is something we talked about, which is we could potentially shrink the timelines and say, in the event we receive data by August 30th or August 20th, whatever that magic date is, we could then shrink the timelines and we'll do redistricting this year. In the event we don't receive the census data by that specified date, then we're going to move it to the following year, which would be 2022. So we are talking about that as an option too. Another question, have we reached out to the Wisconsin League of Municipalities in regards to this? We talked to them last week. This was not really on their radar, but we indicated that we'd like to work together with them since this is an issue that not only affects counties, but also municipalities. So we'll be following back up with them later this afternoon. Andy, a question from Mark Harris. If state district lines do not coincide with county board district lines, won't that result in wards with 2 different ballots?
Yeah, potentially. That's a good question, Mark. And I can't recall. I saw another question in the chat or in the Q&A about what happened in 2011 when we had challenges to the state redistricting process. I'd have to look back and see exactly what those challenges were based on. When I spoke earlier about the state having a separate process from counties and municipalities, that isn't to say that what the counties and municipalities do don't impact the state process. But I was saying there's no statutory mandate that there be cooperation between state legislative redistricting and county and municipal redistricting. That was my only point. In other words, the counties don't have to transmit their plan to the legislature, who then takes a look. Our process is completely independent of the state's process, but I do think, to Mark's point and the other point in the Q&A, that there will have that the county process will have an impact on the state process.
Andy, just a comment from Kara in Outagamie. With public hearing, public comment, and sequencing of board approval processes, compressed timelines are incredibly infeasible from Kara's perspective. Thank you, Kara. That's helpful. That's the kind of that we're looking
Here's
for.
my question: is do we need 60 days? I mean, it's there. Do we need 60 days the way we currently operate? That's a question for everybody. I don't know the answer to that. From a very practical perspective, would 45 work? Okay, we've got one. Yes, we need 60 days. Okay, that's good to know.
And yeah, a couple people in the chat have said, yes, we need 60 days. So that's very helpful for us as we, Andy mentioned that we have met with members of the legislature. Marcy, I believe on Thursday, we're meeting with Speaker Voss on this again.
Yes, we had conversations with his staff this summer, like Andy said, when there was first rumors that we were going to get a delayed information from the Census Bureau. And then I reached back out to them, and we're meeting with his staff that is working on this and his chief of staff on Thursday.
And Andy, from Jim Milkey in Dodge County, is there a downside of doing nothing and retaining the existing boundaries? This seems to be a reasonable approach. Keep it simple. I guess before I offer to you, when we say do nothing, Jim, I think what what we're referring to is we have to do something legislatively, we feel, because there are statutory requirements that we don't want to be in conflict with. Now that something maybe, statutorily, we just change the law so that we can redistrict next year. I think we have to do something, but I think his question specifically, Andy, is what's the downside of retaining the boundaries for another year?
I don't know that there's a downside. The only wrinkle that I see happening is that if we redistrict in 2022 as opposed to 2021, we've got a fall general in 2022. And so the question would be, what happens with that fall general? We don't have a fall general this year. We have a spring. So I think the way that they set this up, the legislature, is so that we have the new districts taking effect spring of odd numbered year, and it kind of rolls out. So, spring of even numbered years, so that it rolls through spring general and fall general. So we'd have to figure out what happens with the fall general election. In other words, if we redistrict in 2022 and we follow the same kind of statutory timeframe that we've got currently, we just delay it for a year, we're not going to have new districts drawn until January of 2022, or December of 2022. Then that means that the fall general elections are going to be under the old district as well. That's more of a legislative issue than it is a county issue. But I see that as being a practical issue that the state's going to want to take a look at.
Andy, I do see from another clerk, Karen Gibson in Dodge County, she's saying, yes, 60 days is really needed to do this process. Question from Steve O'Malley, Andy, is there any benefit to using the census estimates by municipality to adjust the lines as much as possible and then correcting it 2 years from now so the lines are accurate?
Well, I mean, that gets into the whole question of, is it a feasible and good option to have some sort of temporary redistricting take effect for 2 years and then redraw the lines based on hard census data 2 years from now? I don't know the answer to that. I think that's more of a question of, is that something that we want to consider as a potential fix?
Then from Kelly Hoffman, if reduced timeline, will the Elections Commission have enough time to update the WISP vote system with new districts? Kelly, that's a great question. We did have a meeting with Senator Bernier late last week and brought this issue up with her. She was meeting with Megan Wolf, I believe that afternoon, Marcy, after meeting with us, and she was going to raise that with her. So we need to follow up with Senator Bernier, but Senator Bernier was going to raise that with the Elections Commission, so we'll let you know what we hear on that front. From Eric, it's the clarification, Andy. Can you answer again what happens if some counties voluntarily compress the timeline and have a final plan approved before December 1, while other counties take the full 180-day timeline and adopt the plan after December 21? The counties with adopted plans prior to December 1 can use them in the 22 spring elections, correct?
I think it has to be an all or nothing approach. I think it's a statewide issue where whatever legislative fix the association pursues, it would be a 72 county legislative fix. I don't know that it would be good to have some counties redistrict earlier than others, but that's just my impression. Kyle, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the legislative fix would probably be uniform and would apply to everybody.
Right.
Carol from Outagamie, has WCA considered what counties should do if there is no legislative fix? Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, but while state statute does impose requirements on us, there are no penalties associated with not meeting those deadlines. Is that correct?
That's correct. There's no penalty. And so realistic, we can take a look at this in a little more detail if whatever fix we have doesn't fly and we're just working with existing statute. And we'll get guidance out as to any sort of problems or issues, but I don't see a penalty and I don't see any sort of adverse effect other than we're going to be running with current district boundaries for the next year at least.
And Ellen Denzer from St. Croix says, I've done redistricting for St. Croix 4 times since 1990, including when we reduced the size of the board. I disagree. We do not need 60 days. That is consistent with what we're hearing from some of the GIS folks. Scott in Bayfield says, this is my 3rd time with this process. The GIS mapping is fairly simple as long as the state imports the data without issue. Creating a draft map can happen in 1 to 5 days, but if it is agreeable to all, where the problem may lay. So it sounds like if you have, communication, you have willing partners, we can possibly do this in less than 60 days, according to Scott's perspective. Andy, Lolita Olson said, how would this affect the timeline if our county board decides to go with a reduced board size?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I see that Jennifer Borlick has asked as well, if you redistrict the next year, is it possible to redistrict an elected supervisor out of their district? And we have that issue currently because current law allows for a midterm redistrict process to reduce the size of the board. And so that happens and the incumbent serves until the next election. And then at that next election with the redrawn boundaries, you may redistrict somebody out of their current district and off of their status as an incumbent. And that happened with several supervisors when the midterm redistricting was done prior to 2010. I don't think we've had any in the last 10 years, but we had quite a few between 2000 and 2010. So that's absolutely a possibility. And that kind of gets into a little bit of the what ifs, where we'd have to take a look at the language and figure out what timeline would apply when the new boundary takes effect, and then what the impact is on the next following spring election when we've got county board supervisors on the ballot.
Doug from Chippewa, can you ask the attendees to respond to why a shorter time frame is not possible? If you could respond to either the chat or Q&A to that would be helpful. Kara did kind of respond. She says, the issue with the timeline is not GIS, but the board approval process. If a board suspends the rules, it is doable, but would need support from county boards. And I think that gets back to our issue of whatever we do, we want to make sure that everybody's doing the same thing across the state. So I think that's that question. Andy, I saw a question here about redistricting. This is something we talked about. If we redistrict next year, could you essentially redistrict an elected county supervisor out of their seat? So can you explain how that would work, given that we have 2-year terms for county supervisors, yet we're redistricting in the middle of that term? When would that new district take effect?
Well, there is this principle in the law that says that an individual has to reside within their district in order to hold their seat. And one of the ways a vacancy is caused in a county board supervisor's seat is that they move out of the district. And so then the question becomes, if we go through the redistricting process, we redraw the lines, then we have a supervisor that is all of a sudden residing outside the district. Does that create a vacancy? And I think that that's something that we're aware of, and we want to make sure that the legislature addresses, to say that the new lines don't impact anything until we have the next election. That would be my initial take. But if we have nothing that happens and we have new lines drawn and we have a supervisor living outside the district, technically under current statute, that supervisor's seat is vacant because he or she lives outside the district, and we'd have to figure out how to deal with that.
And Lynn raises a good point. We know that there's been a lot of turnover with the Office of County Clerk in recent years. She said that some of us new clerks, this will be our first process, so the shorter time frame could be problematic. Then Randy Scholes says, has the state said what they are currently thinking? Randy, I can tell you that we have mentioned this to the speaker and legislative leadership. They seem to understand it's a problem. But again, I don't think we've got a firm commitment. We're hoping to learn a lot more on Thursday when we meet with the speaker's office on that. Clark Schrader, is there a summary that we could share with our board so they are not surprised? Andy, can we put together kind of a one-pager on this, just outlining what the issue is, what some of the potential solutions are, and then blast it out to the membership?
Yeah, and I think, in just thinking about that, would it be helpful for us to pull the statutory language, highlight it, and suggest what could be changed within the statute to alleviate this problem by either pushing this by 1 year or compressing the timelines? And I think that might help counties in terms of the explanation to the board. And I think, frankly, it might help you and Marcy in your conversations with the legislature. Does that sound about right?
Absolutely.
I'm glad Ben's taking notes on that.
From Kimberly, the county board needs to adopt the tentative plan and adopt the final plan. We need to factor in the time needed for county boards to meet. Also need to factor in time for the notice and the public hearing requirements.
Well, it's not lost on me too that we're talking about compression of time frame during budget season. And I know that counties are very, very busy during budget season, going through that entire process with public hearings. And so I'd rather avoid confusing the public about a variety of public hearings dealing with budget or redistricting and all of these other important issues. And so that's one of the things, at least in my mind, that, yeah, I mean, the GIS data may allow us to redraw these lines pretty quickly. It's public input, public hearing, county board action that I think takes some time. And certainly I, don't necessarily want to rush those decisions.
And then Andy, from Melissa Johnson, this is something we've talked about too, given historical litigation or redistricting. Is there a risk that citizen groups may sue counties to meet the statutory deadlines regardless of census data? Redistricting is about representation, so could they claim the failure to redistrict disenfranchises members of the public?
Could they claim? I suppose they could. But if you look at the statute, the first trigger is receipt of census data. So I don't know that anybody could force a county into redistricting based upon receipt of anything other than actual census data. In other words, we may have preliminary data coming out. Could somebody claim that that preliminary data can force a redistricting? I don't know. I don't think so, but I am not nearly as creative as the plaintiff's bar on this. So I hesitate to say that don't worry about it. But I just don't see that as being a real risk here, because we do have comfort in the actual statutory language and that trigger being receipt of the actual census data.
Then Andy, from Sue Hendrickson, the whole discussion of shortening timelines is based on the date the feds deliver the data. And we may need readjustment if the data info from the feds that we receive is wrong. So that kind of gets to, one of the issues that we kind of see with this hybrid approach potentially is that very question. We don't know when we're going to receive the data. We don't know if there is going to be changes or inaccuracies within the data. So I think from our perspective, the easiest way to do this is to work with the legislature if they're amenable and delay redistricting 1 year. I think, from what we're hearing, that seems to be the easiest way. Again, we would want to look though, and Andy and his team would want to look at, are there any unintended consequences of going with that approach? Joe Marsick, Andy says, why not take a 2-year hiatus and just redistrict in 2023?
Well, I mean, that's a really good point, because honestly, then we don't have to worry about the impact on the fall general election, because I would imagine that we've got what is the deadline for taking out papers for the fall primary? I realize that they're countywide seats or statewide seats, or state legislative seats. We've got a gubernatorial race. I don't think we don't have any county district races that appear on the fall general ballot. So I don't know that it's as important, but I mean, to me, again, I think that it would be easier if we just delayed it for 2 years, because that would put us back on cycle for what we want to accomplish. But I haven't thought through exactly what the unintended consequence of that may be, because again, if you remember, there is existing statute that talks about a petition process by citizens to downsize a county board. What happens if we delay this by 2 years, and in the intervening 2-year period, we get a petition from a citizen to reduce the size of the county board? I'd have to think about how that works as well. So that, to me, it seems like a really good practical result. I just have to think about, again, the unintended consequence and how that interplays with some other statutes.
And Andy, how would that work with municipalities who have staggered elections too?
I mean, it would just delay their process by 2 years. They go on current ward boundaries until the election in 2020. What would that, 2024?
Kayla says, do we have a timeline of when a solution will be decided upon, so we know at the county level what we need to be doing throughout the year? Kayla, I think it's our hope that after our Thursday meeting, we'll see what the speaker's perspective is. We'll then have a meeting with Majority Leader Lemahieu, who heads the Republican Senate caucus. And I'm hoping by early to mid next week, we'll have a pretty good idea of what the legislature's reception is to this. and we'll be sure to update the group. So hopefully by next week, we'll have additional information to share. And then Catherine Shaw from Eau Claire, delaying the process will raise the least number of questions from citizens who may otherwise feel disenfranchised if the timeline is compressed too much or changed multiple times, as the data may not arrive for an expedited timeline. Well, Catherine's perspective. Andy, Marcy, anything else that I missed here?
No, I think this is good. I think all of us are anxious to hear what the legislature thinks about this. They may have considerations of their own that we just aren't thinking of. So I'd like to hear their perspective. But I think the point of all participants on this call is we're going to see a one-size-fits-all approach. It's going to have statewide uniformity. And so I'd like to make sure, and I'm sure the association would like to make sure, that if they pitch the legislature on compressed timelines, that we don't have 10 counties throwing their arms in the air and say, great idea, association, I can't meet these compressed timelines. I can't do it. And so I think this is an issue where it will be a bit cumbersome, but we want to be in constant contact with all of the counties to make sure that whatever solution an idea is out there can actually be implemented. And I don't know, Kyle, if you have additional thoughts on that, but I think right now we're just in the solution generation process. What are the potential solutions? When it comes down to final position on this will work, I think it's going to have to be a discussion with, again, all counties to make sure that there's no unintended consequence where, again, 10 counties are saying we can't do this. So.
A comment from Ellen Denzer: for counties and municipalities that have seen geographic change in population, waiting 2 years would mean a longer time frame of unequal representation. That invites more challenges, which would likely be justified. Jerry Iverson: do we know why the Census Bureau has delayed the data to counties? Can the feds be asked to expend the dollars to get the data to counties on time? Marcy, I don't think we've really got a good explanation from the Census Bureau as far as why the delay. I think we assume COVID, but I don't think they've given us a good justification, have they?
From what I've heard, there hasn't been a reason granted for why it's been delayed. I think the COVID has been thrown around, but other than potentially an employee not in the office to release the data, we don't really know why the information hasn't been released and why they're making a statement that it could be after July 30th. So it's unclear why this is being delayed, but that's a great question. And we have yet to find out why the delay is so great.
From Eric Damcott: my county is eager to reduce the size of its board. If redistricting is delayed, it will force a change in those plans. I don't believe that will be a popular outcome in my county. Steve O'Malley: is there any means for pressuring the Census Bureau on the federal level to accelerate getting the data completed sooner? I can tell you, Steve, that there are a number of states that are impacted by this, some even greater than Wisconsin, given their elections and timeframes that they're dealing with. We do have a report from the National Conference of State Legislatures. We will be reaching out to NACO, and I know that Senator Bernier was reaching out to Senator Johnson at the federal level to see if Congress can put any pressure. So we are going to explore that option, Steve. From Jody Spencer: wouldn't a 2-year wait hold back any fair mapping efforts and extend those representatives in severely gerrymandered districts? Seems to fit with some agendas and will likely create public backlash. Jody, I think it's important to remember that I think you're referring probably to state legislative districts. I'm not sure anything that we do is going to affect what they're going to do. I do believe the legislature will pass redistricting new maps sometime this year. Whether or not the governor signs them, I think is a different story, but we're talking specifically about local county and municipal boards and districts. Andy, any questions that I missed that you see here?
Just take a look quick. I don't see anything that was missed here. Certainly appreciate the feedback here because again, at the very practical level, we want to make sure that whatever solution is thrown out there is able to be implemented. So appreciate the feedback. And this is an issue where, again, I think the association will be in pretty regular contact with all of the counties to talk to all of you about the potential solutions that are on the table. We'll get the information out as it relates to what we discussed here today, either delay in terms of when the redistricting process occurs or compression of timeframes and what that might look like. We'll get that information out to you so you can start the discussions with your county board. In the meantime, I know Kyle and Marcy are going to speak with the legislature about their considerations. And so I would not be surprised if we aren't on another call like this here in the relatively near future to talk about what the considerations are.
So Andy, just two additional questions here I see from Karen Outagamey. How will you engage with counties moving forward for our input, insights, etc.? Kara, I think based on what we're hearing today, I think what we could probably do is maybe sometime late next week or the following week, depending on when we can get in with Senator Lemieux. I think maybe we can have another call similar to this and outline that. So we'll work on that. But if there are things that arise prior to that call, we'll make sure that we put them in Andy's memo. But as always, for everyone on this call and everybody in county government, if you have questions, input, insight, suggestions, please don't wait for one of these calls. Please just give Marcy a call so that we can make sure that we're considering all that input. And then
I see that there's another question here. Is there a best practice for number of supervisors per population? It depends on the size of your county board and the size of your county. It's the one person, one vote principle means that there's equality of representation across the districts, the supervisory districts in the county. So let's take an absurd example and say there are 10 people that live in your county. You've got a board membership of 10. Each district should have one person in it, one person, one vote. Coincidentally, that person would be serving on the county board, but that's a different issue. And so it really depends on the population of the county and then the size of the board.
Andy, from Ellen Denzer, perhaps I missed it, but could the upcoming county and municipal elections be for a one-year term instead of 2?
There'd be so many statutes we'd have to change on that. I don't know that. I mean, theoretically, yeah, that could happen, but there would be a lot of statutes to change on that. Plus, you've got the cost of successive elections. I mean, it's a pretty involved process, in my estimation.
And then a reminder here from Jill, I think this is directed to me. Remember, we have an election next week. So I think what Jill's saying is, how about we don't have a webinar next week, but the following? So we will plan on that. We will do that. Somebody has their calendar up. The week of the 22nd. Why don't we plan on a webinar the week of the 22nd? Marcy, why don't you work with Chelsea to get that invite out? Again, we will have something out from our legal team at Briesen prior to that, but we'll plan to have a follow-up webinar on the 22nd. And again, if there are new issues that arise before that, we'll make sure that we send out an email alert. So I think we've answered all the questions. I hope this is helpful. I can tell you from the Briesen and WCA perspective, this has been incredibly valuable for us to hear your feedback and perspective on some of the options. We know that this is not an ideal situation, but we're going to roll with the punches here, and the association will do whatever it is we can do to make sure the decennial redistricting process works as efficiently and effectively for all 72 Wisconsin counties. So again, thank you. Check out your email for a memo from Briesen, and we will see you again in a couple of weeks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.